Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Today on the Voice of Yoga, we will talk about cultivating sensitivity for the invisible, intangible, divine omnipresence. Listen as we explain the physics of spirituality and how like attracts like. Only spirit knows spirit. In this show, we will discuss the art of using the corporeal sense testimony to determine individual level of consciousness and degree of awareness. How do I know divine mind is conscious of itself as me? Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and hold to the true course. Swami, the title of today's show is Developing a Spiritual Compass. That sounds like some things that we need to do.
Yeah, to be inspired by divine truth, one must know what and where divine truth is. And I really like some statements that you can get from Mary Baker Eddy, and one is, tell the truth about the lie and tell the truth about the truth. What does it mean to be spiritually blind, to be unconscious of the divine creation? And can a blind person drive a car? Why do we have to pass a vision test to get a driver's license? These are some of the things we want to try and focus on here. How do we know that we are conscious of the divine truth?
So my question to you is, how do we know if we know the divine truth, and do we need this spiritual compass? What would be some of the indicators?
What we've been really focusing on here is knowing the difference between thinking and knowing, the difference between thought and divine idea. The mortal mind works on contrast. It works in duality. It's a splitter, a divided consciousness that cannot bring forth the divine image because spirit is whole. It's complete. It's absolute. And you can't have both in the same field of awareness. We want to develop methodology so we understand where our thought is coming from. Mary Baker Eddy used the term impersonalize, not to fear, love, or hate anything that appears in the corporeal senses. And this is 180 degrees from the way that we approach our lives with our Western socialization. All we know is corporeal sense level of living. And so we need to open ourselves up to spiritual awareness. In order to do that, the term in the Bible is repent, think differently. We have to cultivate spiritual sense. Now, we don't cultivate spirit, but we must cultivate spiritual sense. We have to stop forming thoughts and opinions based on information coming through our corporeal senses, and we make the mind aware for the presence of the divine truth, the divine creation.
What's interesting about using the compass is, I think if anybody's ever used a compass, they know if there's a magnet close to the compass, it's going to throw off your direction. I just came to this thought while you were talking. We need to be aware of these corporeal senses are going to throw us off our spiritual path.
Yeah, to help understand this question a little bit, I have a soundbite from a work by Gilbert Carpenter, Mary Baker Eddy, Her Spiritual Footsteps. chapter 6, and I'll play it.
The early environment of Mary Baker Eddy was Calvinistic, which means that the whole trend of thought at that time was on the serious side, with long sermons and solemn Sabbaths. But Mrs. Eddy was reaching out for warmth and joy and, not finding it in the church of her fathers, she sought it in the intellect, in literature, and in poetry. It is reasonable to believe that this early solemnity of thought was a better field to take off from than would be one so grown up with beautiful vegetation that it offered little opportunity for an airplane to taxi around. In order to gain the necessary speed, you must have a clear field for a good takeoff, and the barren Calvinistic field was well suited to this purpose. In such a doctrine was to be found little human warmth or mental recreation to balance properly the somberness of thought. It was a faith which contained little sweetness to make it attractive. For this reason, no one could long sustain his or her interest in it, except from a sense of duty, and duty carries man but a short distance along the spiritual path. First, Mrs. Eddy turned to the intellect, believing that through study and the acquiring of book knowledge, she might meet her needs. However, intellectual pursuits never constitute anything more than a mental skeleton, even though they may furnish a preliminary scaffolding. Such has no value unless filled out with beauty, warmth, and desirability. The Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37 represents the effort to gain spirituality through the intellect, yet the moment any true spirituality is born in on such a thought, the bones come to life, take on beauty and form, and express the graces of the Spirit. There is an error abroad that attempts to set forth that, in her early days, Mrs. Eddy had these graces of the Spirit naturally. If this were true, then unlike the students she taught and the members of her church, she made no spiritual progress. Yet, if there is any one thing we must conclude concerning Mrs. Eddy, it was that her spiritual understanding was continually developing and growing. In order to understand all of her steps, however, one must understand her first steps. If these had been complete, it would imply that she made no progress. When our troops surprised the Hessians, who were the soldiers hired by the British in the Revolutionary War, they were celebrating Christmas and were full of meat and drink. This was a celebration of enjoyment and religious loyalty, which normally would be considered not only harmless, but orderly and proper. Yet, as far as results were concerned, the soldiers might just as well have swallowed deadly poison and been on their deathbeds, since, because of the circumstances, they fell an easy prey to the sword. Does not this illustration show why human satisfaction and well-being exhibited by her students disturbed Mrs. Eddy? Her rebukes were based on her knowledge that such a mental condition was just as effective in clogging thought, and so barring the spiritual idea from man's door, as would be fear, which forcibly ejects the spiritual idea. Yet, there is this difference. When the spiritual idea is forcibly ejected, you desire to regain it more than anything else in the world. If you have learned any processes that will bring the Christ back, you will put forth every energy in order to accomplish this. On the other hand, when the spiritual idea is barred because of human satisfaction and apathy, man's desire grows indifferent, unless sharply rebuked, and indifference is just as effective in keeping it out as would be a window heavily barred. There is a temptation that has been put forth by error for man to believe that the wisdom which alone can guide the Christian scientist aright is something which may be developed through experience or by the mere human study of Mrs. Eddy's works. Yet, the sum total of her teaching is that divine wisdom is that wisdom which comes from God. It cannot be developed, but must be reflected. Hence, the study of Christian science through the Bible and Mrs. Eddy's writings, plus the effort to demonstrate her teachings, is necessary to enable the student to locate, understand, and neutralize those errors that fill thought, and effectively prevent the wisdom of God from entering the hearts of men. So, logically, anything that prevents the things of God from being reflected by his idea, man, must be considered the enemy of the student, no matter how apparently good. This assertion will help to explain Mrs. Eddy's frequent rebukes for that which, on the surface, did not seem to merit such a rebuke. It is interesting to note this perplexing point, that Mrs. Eddy did not rebuke evil in the common use of that word. She rebuked that which she knew to be a spiritual deterrent in the students' efforts to hold up her hands. Evil is self-explanatory in calling attention to one's erroneous human thinking, whereas human good, which also has its origin in human thinking and hence is a natural enemy of God, is something that may require a loving explanation by a spiritually minded person who is able to detect the error in order to be seen as evil.
This is why we really focus on the practices that we use in Kriya Yoga as being very helpful, because you train the mind to serve spirit, and then you train the body to serve the mind with that symbol. The idea of feeling and thinking. Now, even though this is at a mortal level of consciousness and you're working with duality, the idea here is to educate your thought up to spiritual apprehension. Matter and mind are very helpful in spiritual development. If you can find the joy at a physical level, using what you really need to produce the feeling in the body that you're happy, you're special, you're good enough, then you have the support of one of the thieves that will rob you. And what Mary Baker Eddy was of the utmost importance in her discovery is that you are drawing from truth and wholeness and not fear, pride, and limitation, which is what's visible and tangible. Now, on a fundamental level, you train the mind to look for spirit. And then if you train the body to use this invisible, intangible omnipresence as your symbol that produces or is associated with your peak experience feeling, look what you just did for yourself. In yoga, every time you take a breath, you reinforce the feeling that you're happy, you're special, you're good enough, because you are connected to something that is pure, powerful, and sacred, and it will never let you down. Until we have purified the mind-body complex and we have internalized this new symbol for validation, then for the most part, we're still struggling by being dependent upon things that are either visible and tangible or invisible and tangible for validation. And as long as we do that, we're drawing from fear, pride, and limitation, and we're in the trap.
Swami, you talked about purifying the mind. Well, what does that look like when we're doing that?
Yeah, to purify yourself physically, we eliminate all the things that are producing cravings and disturbances, all these unnecessary dependencies based on what we will call our highest understanding of right. Having a value system that's in accordance with universal order, knowing the difference between a need and a want, is paramount. And to understand your needs in their order of importance, because we can live weeks without food, we can live days without water, we can live minutes without air, but we can't live a millisecond without the grace of God. And so that must be first at the top of your order. To support spiritual progression, it's important to have this in place before you start the journey. Now, mentally, the idea here of mental purity is to think, feel, say, and do one and only one thing. The way that I check this is I listen to what I'm saying and I watch what I'm doing. And if I say one thing and I do something completely different, then chances are that I feel something alien to the two above. So this would be considered impure thought in yoga.
So we also have to watch what we're thinking and how we're thinking too, correct?
Oh, exactly. And to know the difference between what is dualistic, matter and mind, and what is spirit. So having this spiritual compass becomes an important tool in being able to keep your life on course, which means that you keep spirit in the foreground of your thinking. We want to stop interfering with it by creating the mental material veil so that we can reflect the invisible, intangible omnipresence, which is perfect, whole, complete.
We're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. Listeners will be back with you in just a few moments. Institute for Personal Development Incorporated is a Kriya Yoga ashram offering yoga classes in all 8 stages of Kriya Yoga, including classes, personal training, teacher training, residential program, online live classes, and online products for self-discovery and transformation. Discover, learn, and practice one of the oldest and purest forms of yoga, Kriya Yoga, by uniting ancient religion with modern science. Visit www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. Swami, let's talk about the question we have in the summary. How do I know Divine Mind is conscious of itself as me?
Yeah, this is a great question that you want to start to contemplate, because Divine Mind is one, indivisible, spiritual substance. And so if there is a me and I'm looking for something out there, that is the division. You know that you are in Divine Mind when you are in oneness. So there can't be a me. And this is something that you learn to start to prove. Mary Baker Eddy does it with inspiration and demonstration. If you are reflecting the divine idea, then there can be no fear, pride, or limitation in the testimony of the senses. You must be reflecting the divine idea, which is all the good, beautiful, and true attributes. And so you use the testimony of your senses. And when you're showing lack, limitation, inadequacy on any level, you have to know you're not in the mind bringing forth the divine image, which means you've fallen back into thinking. You're in the lie. And tell the truth about the lie. Persons, places, things. This is not the divine creation. And if that is confusing to you, then you have to start to understand the truth about the truth. And to do that, we have something here from Joel Goldsmith. Maybe you could read that for us.
This is from Joel S. Goldsmith from Realization of Oneness, Chapter 5. All our discords have to do with our belief that we know what things are good and what things are evil. But there are no things that are good, and there are no things that are evil. God is the substance of all form, and therefore there is no evil form in all the world. Whether you are ready to accept it or not, the truth is that there also is no good form. There is only God form, a form that has no opposites. What then are these forms that we believe with the eyes? Concepts. Concepts which have been etched into our minds by the belief of good and evil. End of the quote.
Concepts, theories, beliefs. We live and move and have our being in duality, in a belief in two powers. It is our belief in these two powers that perpetuates this cycle of death and rebirth. And the only way that we can get out of that is to know the truth that makes us free from the belief. In yoga, we understand that relationship between what we will call life-sustaining force number 1, thought, and life-sustaining force number 2, breath. Your rate of breath equals your rate of thought. By controlling your breathing, you can control your rate of thinking. This gives you an epistemic tool you can start to use to help you control your thinking. Eventually, we learn how to stop thinking We learn how to rise above the influence of the corporeal senses, and we learn to make the mind aware for the presence of the divine creation. The divine creation is everywhere always. It's absolute, out of time, space, concept, belief. It's out of human thinking, personal sense. We have to master the mind-body complex before we walk reason through the open door of revelation. But we have to be able to come out of the belief we're not one with the divine principle, and then proving it. Healing becomes the litmus test. How we think is what we become. And as Mary Baker Eddy discovered, if you draw from fear and pride and limitation, that's what we become. And there's a big difference between finite good and absolute goodness. There's a difference between mental material energy and spiritual substance. And she uses this thing called chemicalization. So you look for the evidence in the mind-body complex to give you clues as to what you are conscious of. Are you sowing to the flesh or are you sowing to the spirit?
That's interesting because getting back to that question, how do we know divine mind is conscious of itself as me? Don't we have to come to this realization of oneness? So there is no me that divine mind needs to be conscious of.
The principle of oneness is a very interesting thing because divine consciousness is the only consciousness. Just like light dispels darkness, truth dispels the error. Knowing the truth about the lie. The error is just a belief, a concept. It's an appearance. It's a reflection. To know the truth about the truth is you know there is only one being, perfect, whole, complete, never looking for anything. Nothing ever has to be added to the perfection of being. Nothing ever has to be taken away. And when we find ourselves battling with these conditions, then we should know that it didn't come from divine mind. And there's your clue that I'm drawing from the wrong energy field. And then what happens with this is in the interim of going from belief in the divine creation, developing faith in it, where you're now starting to demonstrate, when you graduate to understanding and you know the truth, this is when divine mind reveals itself to you from within. The idea of the birth of Christ in consciousness, the Messiah, the interface that makes the divine creation comprehensive to human consciousness. Now, when we activate spiritual sense, we're no longer groping anymore. We know the truth because we're no longer thinking with the mortal mind, but we're knowing with the divine mind. And when this revelation dawns on us, we realize the oneness of everything. We're out of the belief now in the many. From that level of consciousness, we're at this vantage point where we are reflecting the divine. This is what was called worship, to glorify the Creator by revealing the truth, which is the divine creation functioning everywhere, always. And it's perfect, it's whole, it's complete. And all the things that we are struggling with on this mental material concept, this belief in a false sense of existence, disappear in the light of this truth.
So the divine truth kind of dissolves this personal sense. So the oneness happens automatically. We wouldn't want anything else but divine truth.
Exactly. And then you rest in the knowledge of this truth. And you see the folly of trying to fix what isn't even there. It's a reflection. It's just like when you look in a mirror. The image that is in the glass across from you, there's no life, truth, intelligence, or substance in that reflection. Now, a very similar thing happens when you start to think differently, that you rise into this divine self, and you're no longer at the level of sense awareness, and you see things as God sees them. I like the term Mary Baker Eddy uses, to think with God as God. That is thinking in the absolute. That is seeing the truth. And the truth is perfect, whole, complete. And once you understand that I am perfect, whole, complete, and not think that you are perfect, whole, and complete, because thinking immediately pulls you back into the false sense of self. You're back in the mind that can't free itself from its own creation. And like the soundbite we had from Gilbert Carpenter, where she said, when the spiritual idea is forcibly ejected, you desire to regain it more than anything else in the world. Now, this is an important dynamic we learn. This is what we talk about, using the animal magnetism of the body to lift you back into the divine self, because animal magnetism works on some pretty interesting symbolism. We want what we can't have. It's like when you go fishing, you don't try and hit the fish with the lure. You pull it away. And this ignites the fear, the need, all of that. And then to use that force in your favor. And if, like she said, if you have learned any processes that will bring the Christ back, you will put forth every energy in order to accomplish this. That's an important thing that we can work with. But the opposite of that, when they talked about contentment and apathy and humans' desire to grow indifferent, unless sharply rebuked, and indifference is just as effective in keeping it out, that's more dangerous.
Swami, so what would be your idea of developing this spiritual compass?
Yeah, creating the mental landscape to support spiritual truth. Having spiritual vision is essential to have an eye for divine truth. And so the developmental process is really found in graduating from thinking with the 5 corporeal senses to knowing with your 7 spiritual senses. In the same way, one can't focus a camera without having clear vision to begin with. This idea of the mind of Christ, the birth of Christ in consciousness, and the strategies we can employ in order to induce this God experience. Mary Baker Eddy would say, to heal by teaching and to teach by healing. Healing is the visible proof of the omnipotence of the divine idea. Spirit is whole without opposite or need and must be perceived as a state of being one. This is what we are striving for, and to know when you are conscious of it as opposed to when you are thinking of it. Thinking of it doesn't demonstrate.
Well, that completes our show for today. Listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On any of the pages you scroll down, you'll see several buttons there that you can press to further your understanding. Swami, any final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and to hold to the true course. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga realization. Namaste.